Hey everybody, this is Dream, and this is going to be a massive first round of the NCAA tournament slate with 16 games. Lots of games here. I will do a team by team breakdown after I give you my top picks for this slate. As far as the picks look like, we have some good value across the board. We also have some mid-level, mid-range plays and some expensive plays. Overall, this slate looks really solid. It's going to be hard because of the massive amount of games, and there's a lot of variance. You know, when you have some teams that are 1 seeds going against 16s, and other teams, 7s and 10s, and 8 and 9s and stuff playing each other, so it really makes it somewhat difficult. But we have some really good plays for you, and I think we're going to have a good slate and a good tournament, so these games should be really good. We have 3 high-scoring games on the slate, over 150 points. Actually, 4, sorry. We have Utah State and Missouri. We have Alabama and Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, Arizona and Princeton, and Auburn and Iowa. Also Texas and Colgate, sorry. There's actually another one. So those are the top scoring games. And then we have a couple really low scoring games with Houston and Northern Kentucky being the lowest at 122 points. And then UVA and Furman at 131 points. So those 2 games are very low scoring. Also Northwestern and Boise at 127 points. And then as for the spreads on these games, we have some really tight games, and then we have a couple blowouts. UCLA is 18-point favorite. Tennessee's 11-point favorite. Houston's a 19-point favorite. Texas is 14 points. Arizona's 14 points. Alabama's 24 points, and Kansas is 22 points. All the other games are under 10 points spread. So overall, I do think the slate is going to be really good. Like I said, I'll do a team breakdown of each team after I get through the top picks here. So we're going to start with our guards. Now, guards, I definitely recommend paying down more to guard and then paying up more at the forward position today. Obviously, we need to average $6,250 per player. And it's going to be pretty easy to find different ways to do that. So I definitely just don't think there's too many high-end guards that we really want to use. My top most expensive guard is Tiger Campbell at $7,900 for UCLA. He's averaging close to 25 to 30 fantasy points a game. He's been playing really good lately, with the exception of the title game for a conference. He's been over 34 fantasy points per in 4 of the last 5, and he's been over 30 for 7 of the last 8. And I really look for him to have a really solid spot game here in a plus matchup against North Carolina Asheville. This is also the last game on the slate, so it will be the latest. But he does have some upside, though his price is not super ideal because it's come up a lot, but that's just an effect of him playing well. Then we're going to look at Marcus Shaver for Boise State. Now, Boise State is in a slower game against Northwestern, but it's supposed to be a tight game, and he does seem to be a little bit underpriced here. He's averaging over 30 fantasy points a game, and he's been really solid lately. He's had some ups and downs throughout the season, but he's a pretty steady player, and while his price is not super ideal, he's been pretty consistent, and so I do like him. He also does rebound the ball pretty well as get some assists, and he's a good scoring guard. So overall, I just think he's a solid option on the slate. Then we'll look at Max Shulga for Utah State. Now, he's averaging around 25 fantasy points, and Utah State is in one of the higher scoring games on the slate against Missouri. I expect this game to be pretty close and high scoring, and he's definitely a guy who has some really big time potential here. He really hasn't hit his floor too much lately either, so he has nice upside, and he's playing a lot of minutes. And obviously in the tournament, teams tend to tighten up their rosters a little bit, and I expect them to do that here. Then we're going to look at Pell Larson for Arizona. Now, he has some nice upside here at this price point at $5,500. He's played pretty consistent lately, and he probably won't hurt you at this price. He does, his minutes are the biggest concern here because his minutes do fluctuate, but he does have upside as his price has been reduced, and they tend to play 6 or 7 guys deep, so he looks really good. JP Pegas for Furman, also very interesting today. He's been extremely good the last 5 games, and his minutes are pretty good. He's scoring dependent a little bit, but he does get some assists and rebounds, which helps. And his price is just really nice for this matchup here. Obviously, it's a tough matchup for Furman against Virginia. It is a low-scoring game, but the way he's priced, he will be okay here. Then we're going to look at Agbo for Boise State. Now, Boise State, like I said, is in a tighter game, but he does have some upside here at this price. He's played pretty consistently, getting over 10 fantasy points for quite a while, and he's averaging 20 fantasy points on the season. He really has only had a couple bad games all year, and in that kind of situation where he's going to play over 30 minutes, he definitely has some viability here. He also rebounds the ball pretty well for a guard, though the only risk here is that game just being too low scoring, but his price is cheap enough that he's worth taking a look at. David Singleton for UCLA. He looks really solid here, as he should play over 30 minutes being the starter. The only problem with him is that he's really kind of scoring dependent, and so he has to score some points to really make a dent here for UCLA. But they do have some nice upside here, and he will be starting with injuries there. And so even if the game gets out of hand, he should actually get more minutes, just as many minutes anyway. So I like him in this matchup, and he's played well, especially in easier matchups on the season. Then we're going to look at Lamont Butler for San Diego State. Now, I really do think he's a viable option today. He's had some ups and downs throughout the season, but he doesn't really hurt you too much too often, and he's got some nice upside and a good matchup. This game should be a pretty mid-level scoring game, and he's on the better team here, so I definitely think he has some good upside here. Then we're going to look at Renee Smith, or sorry if I'm butchering your name, for Charleston Cougars. Now, this is one of the games I think that they could actually pull off a win here, and he has had no really floor games in over a month, and so I really think he's in a good spot. He does play well, and he plays a decent amount of minutes. They don't really play anybody a max amount of minutes, but he has some nice upside here, and I think he's viable on the slate. Also, from the same team, Jalen Scott. Now, he's a little bit more risky than Renee Smith, but he has just as much upside, and he's been pretty consistent as of late, playing 25 to 30 minutes, and he doesn't need to score in order to pay off fantasy-wise, but obviously that would be a bonus in this matchup. So that's what I have for the guards. For the forwards, we are going to take a look at some more expensive players at this position. I really do think that they're better here in the forward angle, and there's plenty value guards that you can utilize to help pay for some of the more expensive ones. So let's go and get into Brandon Miller. Now, Brandon Miller has some very nice upside. He's played extremely well lately. His price is actually pretty good considering how dominant he's been, even though it's come up a lot. The fact that he's been over 40 fantasy points a lot lately really gives him some upside here. He's not a must-play because he is the most expensive play, but he is viable on the slate. Azuolas Tubelis for Arizona also looks very interesting today for Arizona. He's got a big-time matchup here, obviously. He hasn't hit 40 fantasy points in 4 straight games, but he's been over 30, and he really doesn't have too many floor games throughout the season. So he is viable here, though it's a little bit risky to the situation being a blowout. Chris Murray for Iowa, also extremely interesting today. He's got some really nice upside for the price. He's really had a lot of really good games lately, and I look for him to continue that in this very tough matchup against Auburn, but he should have some good upside here. Jalen Wilson is probably one of my favorite plays on the slate against Howard. He's definitely got a good matchup. His price is a little bit reduced, and he has just as much upside as anybody else on the slate. I really do think he's viable here, and he's been playing really well. Kyle Filipowski, also very interesting today. He's got just as much upside as anybody. He's been more streaky throughout the season than all the other players, but his price is in a fair range for the matchup here against the easier an opponent, and I expect him to play well in this matchup. He's played better as the season's progressed too, so that gives him some upside, and so he's definitely somebody I would consider in your lineups. Then we're going to look at Noah Clowney for Alabama. Now, he should be a pretty decent play here. He's not a must-play because his price is up, but he's been playing well, and that's why his price has come up some. He's not somebody that I think is a must-play, but he's viable on the slate. Then we're going to look at Drew Pember for North Carolina Asheville. Now, he played at Tennessee before, so he has an advantage there. He's a little bit risky because it's a tough matchup against UCLA, but he's been extremely good all season long. He really has not even been bad against the slightly tougher opponents that they played early in the year, and so I expect him to play well in this one. He's got big time upside. He's got rebounding potential. He's about as safe as a $8,000 player as you could get in a tough matchup, and so he's definitely viable on the slate. And then we're going to look at Tyson Degenhart for Boise State. Now, he's been a little bit streaky, but he's averaging 25 fantasy points on the season, and he's got an interesting matchup here for Boise State. It should be a pretty tight game despite being low in price, low in scoring, rather. His price is fair enough that we can take a look at him as a viable option here. And then Charles Bederico, he's probably one of my favorite forwards overall on the slate. He's just underpriced, frankly. His price has somehow come down, despite the fact he's been playing extremely well. The only risk here is his minutes are kind of inconsistent, but if this game becomes a blowout, he would probably play more minutes as a result of that, and so I don't really find him to be too risky, considering he has nice upside as well. Then we'll look at Shai Odom for Howard. Now, this is a very risky value play, but he's had some really big-time games throughout the season, and he really doesn't hurt you with really terrible games too much. Though, it's a little bit risky, but his minutes should be in the mid-20s, and I expect him to play pretty decently in this game as a good option. So with that said, guys, let me get into my top tier, my breakdown of each individual game. And so we're going to start with that here, and let's go ahead and get into that. So the first game on the slate is West Virginia and Maryland. Now, this game does have a 2-point spread and 137 point total. I don't think this game is going to be particularly great fantasy-wise. There's a lot of secondary plays on West Virginia. No one really jumps out as a must-play, and they are slightly overpriced. As for Maryland, it's really easy to pass on this team, as they just don't have a lot of good priced players here. Despite it being a tight game, both these teams are pretty average offensively and defensively, and so I look for it to be a tough game, but not a great offensive game either. It's kind of in the middle, and everybody just seems overpriced here. The next game we have here is Virginia and Furman. Now, Virginia is projected to win this game by 6. It is a low-scoring game at 131 total points. For Virginia, the best play here is Gardner, though he isn't ideal. But it's a slowdown game, and UBA offense isn't anything to be super excited about. And they do play a pretty good slow pace, and they do have a tougher defense. As for Furman, they actually do have a decent offense, and I do expect Pegas to be the only viable play for them. He's actually priced pretty decently here, but their offense, their defense is not very good, and they're pretty low on the KenPom rating as well at 90, one of the lower rated teams especially considering they're a 13 seed. I expected them to be a little bit higher than that, but they aren't very high, so I don't expect Furman to put up too much of a fight here. But it will be closer because Virginia plays a slowdown game. As for Utah State and Missouri, now, Utah State, I should have been doing this, I'm sorry about that. Utah State and Missouri have a pretty tight game at a 2-point spread. I actually think Utah State is in a lot better shape here. Both of them are good offensive teams, but Utah State's played more consistent defensively throughout the season, and Missouri has more, kind of questionable losses. Though I do think Missouri has the best player on the team in Kobe Brown, but I do think if you look at Utah State, Shugla, Ashworth, Aiken, and Monk all have some value. I think it should be a decently high-scoring game, and with that, I don't think that you'll have too much issue if you do pull some players from this game, but there's nobody that really jumps off the page as must-plays either. As for the Kansas and Howard game, this game has a 146-point game spread, and this is fairly interesting. McCullough is a game-time decision, but it does look like he will play, but if he didn't play, then you would definitely have some value plays open up. But I do expect him to play, and Howard is one of the worst teams on the slate. Kansas should run them out of the gym. The question fantasy-wise will be if the Stars get enough minutes, but Jalen Wilson should be a pretty good lock here. He's priced pretty fair despite that risk, and he should get around 30 minutes and he did that a lot early in the season. Even in blowouts, he would still play, around 30 minutes and get big time scores. So I don't really feel too bad using him, other than the fact that it could be over at halftime. As for Howard, they do play a deep bench, and it's an ugly matchup. The only other team closer to KU that they played is Kentucky, and that game was early in the season. Dockery, Williams, and Odom have some value play upside here, but they're super risky because of the matchup and the unlikelihood that they keep this game close. But if you wanted to, take a crazy pill, then you could definitely load up on Howard beating Kansas and go balls to the wall and win if it actually happens. But they are the worst team on this in this slate at the Ken Palm 216. They're the only team on this slate that's even in the 200s offensively and defensively. And so I think that they are a good team to avoid, and Kansas is a good team to keep an eye on. As for the Alabama and Texas A&M Corpus Christi game, now we did get a sneak peek at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, but Alabama is one of the best defensive teams in the country. This game should be very lopsided. Bederico, Miller, and Clowney all have nice upside. Some risk here due to blowout, obviously. Texas A&M Corpus Christi is also the worst defensive team on the slate. I don't expect them to really do much here, and Alabama is the second best team on the slate in general, so I think this is a good matchup for them. And I think Texas A&M Corpus Christi is a team you want to avoid. But if you had to use somebody from this team, Mashula and Tennyson would both be two guys that you could consider. But I would. Then we're going to look at San Diego State and College of Charleston. Now, this is a 5-point spread in San Diego State's favor. I do feel like this is the game that could be the 12-5 upset. Both these teams have an interesting offense, kind of a mid-level offense. San Diego State does have a better defense, but the issue with them is that they just don't play a big schedule. And while they do have Lamont Butler, who's probably the best option from a fantasy perspective, there's not much else there to really like too much. As for College of Charleston, on the surface, this game does look like a game they could win. They do play a deep bench, which is risky for fantasy. That said, Smith, Scott, and Robinson in that order are priced cheap and viable as value plays here. Anyone above 5K on this team is a strong no, though. But if you think they can pull this game off, then they are viable here. Looking at Arizona and Princeton, this game has one of the higher scoring games on the spread, but on the slate, and Princeton is not a very good defensive team or offensive team, but they do tend to play a slower type of game, so I would avoid them from the fantasy perspective. Though Arizona does have some upside with Tubelis and Larson, but they are a little bit risky. Ballo and Krissa may be a little bit limited in this game due to injuries and stuff, and I would expect them not to play a full complement of minutes if the game gets ugly early, and it should, quite frankly. Arizona is a really good team here. So as for Arkansas and Illinois, now this game is a 2-point spread, and it does have a decent scoring output here at 144 points. So I do like that, but both these teams are pretty good defensively. And as much as I like some players on Arkansas, they are priced high. Nick Smith being healthy also limits some of the upside because it deepens the roster, which they go 8 or 9 deep sometimes. Illinois is one of the better defensive teams on the slate, but I still expect Arkansas to win. But it does feel hard to utilize guys in this simply because of the matchup here, and because both teams have had injuries throughout the season, and some of their guys are priced up because those guys have come back from injury recently, and so they haven't really come back down to reality, when, a guy that's been starting for a few games now coming off the bench, or even just getting less usage as a result of that. As for Illinois, Hawkins and Shannon are the best plays. I don't really see them winning the game, though, and so it is a little bit risky, but Shannon has the most upside if you wanted to use somebody from Illinois. As for Auburn and Iowa, Auburn's projected to win this game by 1 point, and you can make an argument for a lot of players on this team. Their offense is not quite as good as Iowa's, but their defense is a lot better than Iowa's. And so I do think that Katie Johnson, Broom, and Green are interesting here, though they are priced up and they are secondary plays in this high scoring game, this being one of the higher scoring games on the slate. As for Iowa, they have one of the best offenses in the country, but they are risky defensively. Murray, Perkins, and Rebraka all have upside here, but they are somewhat risky. Murray is the guy with the most upside, but I don't think anybody here is exactly a must play, but they're all definitely secondary plays. As for Duke and Oral Roberts, Duke is favored to only win this game by 6 points, which is a little surprising. But 12-5 matchups tend to be kind of crazy, and I could see a young team like Duke have some issue here. Filipowski, though, does have the most upside here, though he has been inconsistent this season. Oral Roberts does struggle to rebound, so I do think he's a good option, and he's probably the best option on Duke. As for Oral Roberts, this is a rough matchup for them. I don't see it as close as Vegas does. Unless, something crazy happens. Their defense is not very good, though they do score the ball decently well. Their guys are overpriced, though, regardless, as they haven't, because probably due to the fact that they have 30 wins on the season. As for Texas and Colgate, Texas is projected to win this game by 14 points. Timmy Allen should be back, which does get him back into the lineup and pushes Rice out, which makes Rice nearly impossible to use because he's still overpriced. Everybody's a little bit priced up due to that injury, and that makes everybody risky. But Hunter and Carr do have some upside, and this does have some. Texas does have some potential here as to have some good players on the slate, as Colgate is one of the worst defensive teams on the roster. As for Colgate, I don't really see how you can roster anybody here. They are overmatched in an ugly matchup against a good defense, and they're just a below average offense, quite frankly. They're also one of the few teams that are outside the top 100 KenPom and on the slate in general. As for Northwestern and Boise, now this game is somewhat interesting because hang on one second, I'm sorry. What did I get? Okay, yeah. It does have a low scoring game, but they do seem to have a pretty good matchup, and it is a tight game. And both teams are kind of good defensively and not good offensively, but they're priced well. And so, like for Northwestern, Boo Buie has some interest here. He's kind of the only one here just because he's the one that's priced the best for them. But for Boise State, even though it's a low-scoring defensive battle, Shaver and Dagenhart both look decent plays. Agbu has some value upside, and I think they can steal the upset here as well. It's an interesting matchup because I expected this game to be kind of unlikely to be good for fantasy, but Boise State is priced under what I expected them to be, and so they definitely give you some upside here. As for Houston and Northern Kentucky, this is one of the lowest scoring games on the slate, 122 points. There's some question about Sasser playing. He's a game time decision. If he plays, then that would make some other guys risky. Now Roberts is a secondary play as well, but this is a low scoring game and people are priced up. I don't expect it to be a great game fantasy wise. And Northern Kentucky is actually one of the better defensive 16 seeds, and who knows how Houston's going to play if Sasser doesn't play. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But I look for Northern Kentucky to be a team that is going to get put away early and often. And also Northern Kentucky can't play offense. They're the worst offense on the slate. They're the worst team on the slate when it comes to KenPom, and I just think it's not worth even touching this team with a 10-foot pole. As for Tennessee and Louisiana Lafayette, now Tennessee is favored to win this game by 11 points, and they have one of the best defenses on this slate. Piscacci, Mashik, and James and Key all have upside. They are somewhat risky, though, but this game does have a blowout potential, and they aren't priced ideally, but they do have some upside here. As for Lafayette, one of the worst defensive teams here, they are an easy team to avoid against Tennessee, though Lewis and Williams do have some upside, but they are very risky. They aren't the worst offense on the slate, so that's not, so they do have a little bit of low-end upside. As for the 7-10 matchup at Texas A&M and Penn State, this is a very interesting game. It has a 136-point spread, which is interesting. It's also a 3-point game for Texas A&M's favor. And it's a pretty even matchup offensively, though where the defense lacks for Penn State. Texas A&M is pretty good here, though it is hard to like Texas A&M because they're priced up. I was hoping they would be priced better here, but Taylor and Dennis are secondary plays. As for Penn State, Jalen Pickett seems decent. Lundy is a secondary play, and you can make an argument for a few others. But I'm not a fan of the teams in this game. Texas A&M is one of the better 17 seed teams in the tournament, and that does not bode well necessarily for Penn State in this matchup. And last but not least, the UCLA North Carolina Asheville game. I definitely like UCLA okay today, though they are favored to win the game by 18 points. And it is a little bit risky due to the injury situation at UCLA, but I could see them have some more trouble than they should. But Campbell and Singleton have really good upside here, and they are one of the best defenses on the slate. Though they do have their best defensive player out and another wide game time decision, so do keep that in mind. As for UNC Asheville, they are one of the better 15 or 16 seeds when it comes to defense, and they do have Drew Pember, who's played at Tennessee and has some good upside in this matchup. He isn't ideal because of the matchup, but he does have double-double potential, and UCLA is going to be tough here in this game, but UNC Asheville is one of the better 15 seeds on the slate. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.